Welcome to The Culture Shift. We want this podcast to empower you as leaders to make impactful change in your workplace. I'm Vicki Baars, and I specialise in transforming organisations through equity, diversity and inclusion initiatives. In each episode, we'll delve deep into the fascinating world of workplace culture. Join me as I sit down with an array of incredible guests, including members of our very own Culture Shift team and industry experts. Through these thought-provoking conversations, we aim to equip you with the knowledge, tools, and inspiration you need to drive positive change in your workplace. Whether it's breaking down barriers, thinking about how you include a more diverse workforce, or fostering a culture of collaboration and belonging, we've got you covered. So let's dive straight into an episode. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Culture Shift today. I'm going to be sitting down with Kenya Peters, Product Marketing Manager here at Culture Shift. And we're going to be talking about whether or not policies can change cultures in organisations. So Kenya, can you introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Hi Vicky, thanks for having me. I'm Kenya, Product Marketing Manager here at Culture Shift. I've been doing that for about a year now, as you know. And my background is entirely in marketing, whether that be activation, product marketing, content, etc. But the reason I came to Culture Shift and the reason that I'm working here now is because alongside that I've had a growing interest in diversity, inclusion and culture change within organizations. So that's been a heavy focus for my role here and also in previous roles where I've tried to kind of through engagement with kind of, your resource groups and your staff networks, increase the amount of work that I'm doing with organizations to help them move their culture forward.
So our topic for today is around whether or not policies can change organisational culture. That we're going to have loads to talk about, but I think it's useful to start from a basis of acknowledging that different organisations will have different experiences of how policies can influence their organisational culture. We work with loads of different size organisations. We're a very small organisation, and we obviously are not that old as well. So Culture Shift in its 6th year, and we have been, purposefully trying to make sure our policies and our processes are fit for purpose and go above and beyond, and that our people understand, know them, and are brought to life. We're very different from big public institutions, for example, that have existed for hundreds of years and will have cultures embedded within that. So they'll have policies that they'll have updated, but actually, the underpinnings or behaviours and cultures that exist within an organisation, they will exist. They will continue to be there. So really, the big question is how do policies actually influence and shape organisational culture? Can we really rely on them to do that? Yeah,
I mean, the point that you make there about organisations being different is so important because you have big organisations, as you're saying, you've got these small organisations, and we're in a uniquely different position to other small organisations because this is our bread and butter. This is what we do all the time. Our ability to remain focused on what our policies look like on paper and then how we live and breathe them, it's so fundamental to the work that we do that we have to do that. Whereas if you look at marketing agencies, I've got a marketing agency background, we never had an HR person. In fact, introducing HR people into those smaller organizations is a new thing because people are seeing that elsewhere, and the cultures in those places can often be very, for want of a better word, toxic, that people are calling for that. There is a hugely fundamental differences in where these organizations are starting from. But again, as you say, the behaviors exist regardless of the size of the organization. Having policies in place is important because essentially they're the backbone, right? They're the safety net that you have to fall back on to say, we've thought about this. If something happens, we know what the process is for resolving that. And you as an employee can look at that policy and say, this is what's going to happen if that behavior happens. But more so, it's a communication of what your expectations of your employees are. It's your way of saying, this is what we expect from you as an individual being within this community. And if you don't uphold those expectations, then this is what would happen as a result of that. When it comes to whether these policies can influence culture, ultimately they're just words on paper,
Yeah.
right? And words on paper isn't really going to do enough to change somebody's behavior. How you communicate that outwardly, how you make that more than just a document that you can find on your intranet and make it a part of the everyday way you do things, that's the way that you're going to start to think about, okay, so how does this policy actually influence the way that we work as an organisation?
One of the things I find really useful about having something written down in policy is that when there is disagreement in the way in which something should be done, going back to your original intention and saying, oh, actually, we do have core working hours, but we have written in our policy that they are somewhat flexible. So you can choose to start your day earlier and end it earlier, or start your day later and end it later. And having that written down somewhere means that everyone is working from the same basis, and it sort of levels the playing field, I think is, a phrase that we use a lot in ED&I. And there's obviously ways in which we want to support people, not just to be on a level playing field, but to redress ongoing issues that they've experienced. But as a basis, like you say, as a backbone, as a start, everyone knowing where they're at and knowing what they can have and what they have rights to, and having that written down somewhere in black and white is really good. Really good.
But then also, where's the empowerment that you're giving to your people to know that they know the policy so well that they have the flexibility to play around with it as well? So being able to say, yes, we have this flexibility in place, but we're also aware that not every employee's lives are going to play out the same. And therefore, a policy that works in when you write it down on paper, in practice, you need to be able to maintain that flexibility to say, we know that the policy says we'll allow 5 days of bereavement leave for somebody if somebody in their immediate family passes away. But if the reality is, well, actually, no, because this person's dad passed away down the road in Manchester and my dad passed away in Australia, you've lost 2.5 days of travel alone.
Yeah.
So where's that flexibility to be able to say, in this case, we have this policy, but how do we adapt that? So in reality, it really works for the people that we're trying to make it work for.
Yeah, and often policy isn't clear in what is a red line and what is flexible. And I think a challenge for a lot of day-to-day line managers is that they are expected to know the policy off by heart. That is hard enough, right? And then they're expected to interpret the policy. They're expected to know which parts of the policy that they can tweak and change and be flexible in. And then when something goes wrong, they're expected to defend their actions as well. So I think, taking on being a line manager is a big responsibility. And actually, I think leaders within organisations can support their line managers to understand how they use those policies in order to support their staff. And it's actually something that I've heard a lot of employees talk about over the years that I've been kind of thinking about writing, improving, working on policies, is that people are like, well, my manager will just do what they want to do anyway. And actually, especially if you're one of those larger organisations, finding consistency with flexibility is that constant balance and that constant challenge.
Yeah, and for me, it just speaks to the overall culture of an organisation. If things are going wrong consistently, people are going to keep looking back at that policy and pointing out where you're doing things wrong, pointing out where there is a lack of consistency in how different managers are doing things. If you've got a culture where people feel safe and supported enough to know that the organisation is going to act in their best interests where they can, and there's this whole contentious point around HR and what HR's role and responsibility is. Is it to represent the organisation? Is it to represent employees? And I think you can understand why, because a HR team does need to ensure that the organisation is protected. But at the same time, the biggest way to help protect an organisation is to ensure that your employees are safe, supported within the workplace. So it is that dual role, right? And when people know that they have a HR team that is going to support them, they're not going to be looking for the flaws. They're not going to be saying, well, you didn't do this and the policy says this. They're going to trust in the fact that it is a human making that decision. It's a human that chose to say, well, actually, this person could take time here because of this reason. And in this circumstance, the decision has been slightly different. it all falls in line with the policy, and it falls in line with the level of flexibility, but it's about building that trust up so that people aren't looking for the flaws in the way that other humans are interpreting and taking action based on the policies that you've written.
And ensuring managers feel that their organisation has their back if they choose to interpret policies in a slightly flexible way to like very appropriately adapt to people's needs. And if they don't, like knowing they're not going to be thrown under the bus for it. And, you know, we deal in lots of things around when people have difficult time in the workplace, right? So we talk about lots of experiences around bullying, harassment, discrimination. And if something that was not followed in policy gets brought up at an employment tribunal, that's a really difficult position for everyone in the organisation to be managing, right? And actually, like, those sorts of horror stories can force managers into a position where they go, wow, if it doesn't say it in the policy, I can't let you do it. And that is like reinforcing problem cultures. And so I guess like I want to bring it onto the point around like policies being living, breathing documents that you are supposed to like regularly review, regularly update. They have their papers, they have their purpose, like they do articulate expectations, if you already said, but they do need to like stay with the moving culture, because there isn't one culture in an organization, it's cultures. And two, those cultures change over time because we are responsive to our environment, we're responsive to wherever you are working in and whatever you're providing, whether that's care services, whether that is selling a product, whether that is providing education, like that, you know, you're responsive to the purpose of your organization. And policies need to respond to that as well, don't they? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, everything's transient, right? The people within your organization are going to continue to move. The environment within which your organization is operating is going to continue to change. And technology is going to advance. The way people are using technology within work, the way it's influencing the way people work, everything's moving around your workplace. So the rules and the guidelines that you have within your workplace, if they're not changing with that, then they become redundant and irrelevant almost straight away. As soon as you've put it in PDF format and said that's it, things can change to make the policies that you've set out not irrelevant, but out of touch and outdated. And going back to what I was saying about, you know, this is a communication of our standpoint. This is a communication of the expectations we have of you as a team. The way in which you communicate that needs to be two-way. So that's first and foremost, before you've even set your policy out, talking to your line managers, the front line of the people that are making sure that your policy is living and breathing, and ensuring that they're brought into the process of creating those policies to be able to say, you know, what are the challenges that you're coming up against? Where are the areas where you need to know what you should be doing and where you need the flexibility to be able to change that? And then once that's established and you've said to your business, you know, this is our policy, what's the feedback back on that? Because if you're getting feedback that says, actually, this isn't going to work for us, but that's a now static piece of guidance that you've set out, people aren't going to engage with it. They're not going to respect it, and they're not going to try and live by it. So I can't remember your question.
I don't think there was so much of a question as amusing. I think we were talking about, like, kind of thinking about, you know, do people actually engage with these policies that are written? And I think your answer there was ideal in the sense of, you know, it has to be brought to life. It can't just be left on a piece of paper in a PDF in the back of the internet when no one sees it. I think, you know, there's a journey that people go on in terms of reading what they can expect from organisations, and part of that is information that people take at application level. So, like, when you're researching a company, like, what policies can you see? Like, do you know if your organisation allows time off for medical transition? If you're a trans person, do you know if your organisation would allow time off for IVF treatment if you're a same-sex couple, or if you're an opposite-sex couple and you're going through infertility challenges? Like, you know, is this information like readily available? Because for a lot of people, it's buried under like like you say, intranets or the back ends of systems, that you can't see that information in advance. And it's quite intimidating to approach an organisation and say, can I read this about this very personal thing in my life before I decide if I want to apply? So I, think best practice is to have a lot of your policies really openly available for prospective employees to see and read and know and understand. And it's why a lot of people do charter marks, for example, because that pulls some of the realities of if you do a Stonewall charter mark, or you do the Disability Confident 2 Ticks charter mark, or any of the others that are out there, if you have done those, you have been audited within your organisation to demonstrate that your policies meet certain standards. And so it's a flag to people to say, sometimes a big old rainbow flag to say, we're inclusive. And I think that's one way of ensuring your policies are speaking to people, but there's definitely other ways.
Yeah, for sure. So this whole idea of transparency is so important. I mean, I'm not an HR professional. My background is not in HR. A lot of my kind of thinking about HR policies has been usually when there's an issue and looking at organizations and being like, well, what was their policy on that?
Yeah.
How has it got to this point where this has happened? And why has it gotten to a point where people have not followed that policy? And like you say, it's usually because people don't know what they are. Yeah. If you look back at HR, the 100 or so years that it's existed, and then you look at the way that HR operates today, there hasn't been the same level of advancement that you see in other functions.
In technology or
if
science,
you look at, looking at HR systems, even the front end HR systems, I know there's a lot of advancement maybe in the past 10, 15 years, but a lot of the time it's very archaic.
And we're no longer filing things in paper form, right?
Some people are.
Oh, no, don't tell me that.
But the way in which we expect people to engage with our policies needs to change as well, right? Whether that is having a podcast, an internal comms podcast, where you're talking about not just the policy, not on page 5 you'll be able to see, but what that actually means in practice, what that means for employees, how they can understand what working within the organization looks like. Or TikTok's great. You can give somebody so much information about what your policy means, what your work culture, and I want to stop calling it what your policy means, because really the policy doesn't mean anything if it's not being lived and experienced by people in your organisation.
One of the things I really appreciate that we do at Culture Shift is once a month we come together and we learn about a specific diversity issue, and that helps to educate our workforce. But in that conversation, it usually gives us an opportunity to talk about our expectations around that thing.
Right.
And that to me is quite I don't think anyone sits at the front and goes, this is what our policy says on this.
Right.
But it is bringing to life the reasons we care about it, why it's important, why we think everyone needs to know about it. It helps with allyship amongst managers and colleagues, and it helps employees to know actually this thing that this might relate to me and it will be taken seriously. And it's kind of, I don't even know if we name check policies in particular when we're talking about that, but sometimes we do talk about things within those policies that exist.
Exactly right. Really practically, yesterday we had our women's health training, and I wouldn't call it training. It's just a learning session. We're learning about different issues that impact people within our team, and we're doing so in a way that's relatable and relates to everybody in the room, even if you're not impacted by that. What does that look like to you as a colleague when somebody's experiencing endometriosis, when somebody's being diagnosed with endometriosis? What can that look like in the workplace, and how can you support that colleague? And then we have our CEO stepping in to say, if you're experiencing these symptoms, you can use your wellness days for that.
Yeah, exactly.
And coming from the top and saying, this is an important issue, and therefore, if you need to use that, I'm telling you as the CEO that you can do that in front of your line managers and directly to you. Just sends a really clear signal that this policy isn't just there because it's something that we have to do. It directly impacts your life, and we want you to consider how that policy impacts your reality and how those two things come together. Because I think there's often a disconnect between what I'm going through in work, what my work life looks like, and the policies that exist somewhere within the organisation that I've not really looked at.
Yeah, or maybe like briefly read it when you first started because you were told to.
Right.
But have you absorbed it because you were taking in so much information on your first week?
Right.
And we rarely come back to it until we need it. Until we need it. This is the other thing I've experienced in terms of policy writing is like, you come back to them often when you're in distress, and that is not a useful time to take in information either. So all the times in which you might engage with it is like when you're overwhelmed, when you're stressed, when you're like in need, and like these are all not great times for information absorbing. Right?
No. And then also you look to, so a lot of the times when I've had to look at policies, it's because somebody's come to me. Because, you know, you work in this line of work and people think you're an expert in things that you are not, but always willing to help. You look at these policies on behalf of people and you try and decipher them for them or find where they are in the first place, and you can't. Like, it's just not accessible in a way that means that when people are, and that's me like going in to support someone and being like, this is overwhelming. So being the person that's in that point of distress, to have to, 1, locate a policy, 2, find the right policy, 3, find the part of that policy that they're looking for, and then 4, understand what that actually means to them.
Yeah. And they're also written in such like legalistic language as well. And that is to protect the organisation. And so then when HR and people teams come to interpret that legalistic sort of terminology, it often like reinforces that myth that HR are there to protect the business and not to support individuals. And having worked in and with HR, it's not the case. Like, most of the people there really do care about like trying to make people's working lives better. But the reality is that they're like working with tools that like tie them up in knots about actually like legal protections and avoiding employment tribunals and these sorts of things.
Right. I think I read that around 58%, upwards of 50%, upwards of 55% of people, of HR professionals are consulting legal firms before producing a policy. And like you said, that makes sense. But why not also bring other people into that process?
Yeah.
So bring your internal comms team, bring your marketing team in, because they're going to think about, how do we communicate this in a way that makes sense to the rest of the team?
Yeah.
How do we communicate in a way that's going to be engaging? So don't stop at the point. Get the legal, make sure you've got the legal backing to say this policy works, the organization's protected.
You're following the law, yeah.
Following the law. But again, that counterbalance of saying our job here isn't only to protect the organization, it's to protect individuals as well. So yeah, that process of asking yourself the questions when you're writing your policy: who's going to be impacted by this? Whose interests are we trying to represent? Who are we consulting in that process? And then who's responsible for crafting the wording around that? All of those things come into play when you're thinking about creating your policies and the policies that are going to work for your organisation.
So we've talked quite a lot about why we'd have policies to set organisational tone, organisational culture, and expectations. I guess it'd be useful to maybe have a conversation about when that goes badly wrong. We see quite a lot of examples of organisations being pulled through the press. Organisations like Brewdog, Save the Children, London Fire Brigade, the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service as well, have all had these big moments where the press have revealed an incident's happened, or a series of incidents, or an ongoing sort of concerning behaviour, and they've brought people in to do these external reviews. And it'd be really interesting to think about, like, do they work? Like, are they making an impact? Are they changing organisational culture?
Yeah. So I think for some of them it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because one of the challenges with those reviews is how much you actually hear from the organisations after the fact. A lot will tell you that there's work happening and changes are being made, but the amount that you see that, particularly as somebody outside of the organisation, is often not as much as you'd hope. But organisations do one of a number of things, right? Something bad happens, and if they are well prepared, well set up, and have a team who are tuned into the issues of things that might be happening, then they can come forward with a collected response and an action-orientated plan on how they're going to make change. The reality is that rarely happens. And organizations go into oh shit mode and can have these responses that inflame the issue.
Overpromising, right?
That's overpromising,
a massive
right?
one.
we do not tolerate these behaviours. This will not happen again. Our senior leadership team are committed to ensuring that these behaviours do not happen within our organisation. And again, it's just words. It's words.
Yeah. You can't eradicate like centuries of sexual violence in the workplace overnight.
Right.
Like these things happen in society. They're going to happen in your organisation. And to claim just because you have been caught with someone perpetrating that behaviour in your organisation, to claim that you can eradicate it with a statement, with an action plan, with a cultural audit, whatever it might be, is a false promise. Like taking it seriously, addressing it, taking like considered action that has been consulted on throughout your workforce, and actually like taking them with you on that journey and realizing it's going to be a pretty long journey. Yes. We talk about conscious transformation a lot, and I personally like have an expectation that you're talking a minimum of 10 years to see a really true transformation from perhaps having like toxic workplace everyday cultures that allow like perpetration of sexual violence, for example, or bullying to continue in the workplace, through to being the kind of organisation where these things probably will still happen, but someone feels safe to talk up about it, you have like effective resolution actions that you take, and also that you've been thinking about prevention of those behaviours in the first place.
Right, and you are hearing about them when they happen, but you're hearing about them less. Because the people in the organisation know that it's something that you will be taking seriously. But you're right, that takes time. Yeah. And nobody's expecting organisations to solve it overnight.
No.
And I think sometimes leaders can feel like the ask is, do something about this to stop this from happening right now.
Yeah.
When in actuality, the ask is, you're going to have three groups of people really when these things happen. You're going to have the people who've been saying it the whole time, and a culture review can be really valuable for just affirming and validating their experiences. You're going to have the naysayers that say this does not happen in our organisation. And you've got a job to do there in terms of bringing them on the journey to say, well, it might not be your experience, but it's definitely an experience.
And evidencing it, right?
And evidencing that fact that does in fact happen within the organisation, whether you want to believe it or not, and therefore we need to make change. And then you're going to have the people that are shocked and like, wow, this happens?
Yeah.
I don't not believe it, but it's shocking news to me. And for them, you need to do something to almost rebuild trust, to say, we know this happens. It's good that you've not had to experience it yourself, but we need you to be a part of the journey to make sure it stops happening for everybody else.
And it's so interesting that you use the term shock, because I think the organisations who have had these issues hit the press, because absolutely we have to admit here, like, most organisations have these issues. Like, it's not that there aren't organisations having these challenges, it's that certain ones hit the press, and it is because their stories provide a shock factor. So I think some of that shock sometimes comes from the exposure of a particular incident, and often not through internal communication, but through the media, usually getting hold of a particular story. Sometimes that has been driven by people who have been the target of that behaviour, feeling like the internal resolutions are not effective within their organisation, and their last resort is to go and tell the press their story.
Yeah.
And actually that can be a really valuable activist tactic to getting an organisation to move, because once their reputation is put at risk, they will do something about it. And it's amazing the number of organisations I've seen throw money into addressing some of these culture damaging behaviours once they've finally been publicly embarrassed about it.
Right. And like, this isn't a call to action to everybody that's like going through something right now to just go to the press. That's not the solution. That's not where we want people to go. We want these issues to be addressed way before the fact, way before the time at which somebody's saying the only way that I can create real and effective change is to go to the press about this.
Yeah.
And organizations don't need to be scared about that, because there can be instances where you have people who are not likely to take your resolution well. We see all the time. Like, one of the biggest things about of going through a case of reporting any form of misconduct is, on the other side, people are rarely satisfied with the outcome, and that's usually the case. So organizations can expect that people will want to do that, but so long as they're doing enough to make sure that the majority of people understand what their actions and their behaviors are, they don't need to worry about people running off to the press. It's when you have a large amount of people saying, my organisation is not actually doing anything about this.
Yes.
That's when it becomes an issue.
Yeah. If the press turn to an organisation and say, what have you got to say about this? And they can go, well, actually, here's the 5-year plan that we've been working on for the last 3 years. Here's all the workshops we've been running. Here's all the prevention campaigns that we've been doing. It's just not a story.
It's just not a story anymore.
So
but you turn to an organisation and say, what have you been doing? And they've got nothing. And they turn to the employees and say, what's going on here? And the employees say, well, actually, there is a story here. Then that's when it's a problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
And going back to your question of do these reviews work? They have an effect. They create public noise, and therefore they create public pressure.
Yeah.
Like I said, they validate the experiences of the employees that are there, and they create action. Regardless of whether we get to see it or not, oftentimes they create some level of action.
Yeah.
The question is, how effective is that action, and how long is that maintained for? How long is that energy kept up? Because we saw it with the McPherson report.
Yeah.
There was a report, there was action, and we're in the exact same place, really.
Yeah, energy just dips, right?
Energy
Everyone
just dips.
Gets enthusiastic about it, says we're going to do something, and then we see that energy dip. And actually, there are a few key things that if you're a leader of an organisation, I think should be taking away from this conversation, which is confessing and knowing you have a problem. Anyone who is denying that their organisation has any culture damaging behaviours in it whatsoever is in denial. It is not true. Every single large organisation will have its challenges. Every single small organisation will have its interpersonal disputes.
Yep.
They might be slightly better, or might be slightly easier to resolve the big kind of cultural stuff because you're smaller, but actually, every single organisation will have its challenges, and being equipped and ready to respond to those challenges is really key. And then with the longer term cultural transformation work, sustaining the resources that you put into it, sustaining the energy, continuous improvement, continuous review of the things that you're doing. Okay, well, we've done that intervention, what next? Looking back at your data, looking at intersecting experiences. There's so much that you could always be doing. This work is plentiful, and it often dries up a couple of years after the big report has been put out.
Exactly. And it goes back to the role of managers and the state of accountability when you put that work out. So who is accountable and responsible for putting that forward? A lot of responsibility is often put on managers to just continue doing the work. But we're managers. My job is product marketing and yours is in cultural transformation. Managing a team and keeping those values alive is a part of our job, not the whole thing. And I think too often, too much of the accountability and responsibility is put there. And that chain of accountability all the way to the top and back down, and that kind of cycle often breaks down. Right, so these reviews come out and we see the reality of the culture within these organizations. And bringing it back to policy, oftentimes these experiences are happening when the policies exist anyway.
That say it shouldn't.
Yeah. So it's not, and one of the responses is often, we're going to look at our policies. You'll end up in the same place. You'll then have a new policy that says that these behaviours really shouldn't happen, and then they'll continue to be perpetrated throughout the organisation, because it's not about the policy alone, it's about the cultures and behaviours that you're allowing to manifest within your organisation.
Absolutely.
I've spent a lot of time looking at the London Fire Brigade report, the cultural review of the London Fire Brigade, and some of the behaviours in there were heartbreaking. I think that's the word that Nazira Saab, who wrote the report, said. You have examples of black colleagues having nooses left at their desk, of Muslim employees having bacon scraped across their plate before they ate food. That is vindictive. That's horrible behaviours that people are perpetrating, and normalised to the point that it's a joke and it's colloquialised as banter.
Yeah.
And it's not that. I couldn't imagine doing that to someone in a million years.
Right.
But it was the behaviours that were normalised. And this isn't to bash the London Fire Brigade, because the report also showed that some of the best cultures that Nazir had seen anywhere existed within the fire brigade.
The trust you need to work in that sort of environment.
Right.
And actually, it's really interesting that some of the things you're saying around sort of banter is actually really what we saw in higher education around the lad culture report that was done back in, I think, 2015, I want to say, maybe a bit earlier than that. We will put a link to it so you can see when it actually was. But that found the same things, right? So it was a lot of the time that lad culture was being perpetrated in like sporting environments where there was that need for like bonding and team building. And actually, like, we've moved through time where the reliance on doing that to create those bonds has been identified as like not necessary. Like, there are other ways that you can build trust and build teams, and it sounds like London Fire Brigade like have that, right? They have ways in which they build that trust and they have those bonds, and that's a wonderful culture, because going into a burning building with someone, you've got to bloody well be able to trust them, right? And so like having these culture damaging behaviours happening at the same time as well, like the need to eradicate them, and the London Fire Brigade are taking these really seriously and continuing to work on it, aren't they?
Yeah, and absolute like kudos to Andy Rowe, who's the commissioner of the Fire Brigade, the London Fire Brigade, for taking accountability and saying, you know, I accept that this is the state of the culture within our organisation and we're taking it seriously and we will do things to change it. But not London Fire Brigade specific. For any organisation that's promising to make these changes, you need to accept that putting things down on paper and writing out a comprehensive plan for what that will look like isn't going to change the hearts and minds of the people within your organisation, particularly going back to those kind of those three audiences, if you will. If you look at those naysayers, making them believe that their behaviours need to change, making them understand that what they're doing that they think is fine actually isn't, and it's contributing to a culture that has dire consequences for people that are at the butt end of those jokes or the laddish behaviour that's causing the behaviours down. And
the group that you were talking about around the people who are like shocked by it, like they're probably the people who it's not being done in front of very often,
right?
And obviously, like, we're talking about big organisations with complex structures, and these are pockets of behaviour. Like, with these, often in these big audits, aren't happening necessarily across the organisation. While some of these behaviours can be pervasive and everyday for some people, it doesn't mean that everyone sees it all the time,
right?
And so, like, educating those people about if they do notice it, what can they do about it, right? And this is where the sort of active bystander work that we do comes into play, like being able to identify something as a problem, being able to take action, like to intervene when you witness it, and then being able to like follow up with the individual who has experienced it to make them know that it's been seen and that their experience is validated and that they're supported, and like those are the people who aren't shocked by the report and actually validates their experiences, right? And I really love this theory that you're talking about with those three different audiences. I think it really helps to exemplify like why these reports work. I'd love us to think a bit more about like, what do people do 3 years on, 5 years on? Like, what's that look like, and how are they sustaining and continuing to communicate back to those audiences?
So years on, 3, 5, hopefully 10 years on, for organisations to take this seriously, to ensure that the changes has longevity to it, you need to do all of those things that we've spoken about already. So you do need to start with policies, I think. You need to start with not necessarily a written down, not necessarily creating new policies, but assessing what the behaviours are that you've stated in the policies, what the behaviours are that you want the people within your organisation to be exemplifying, what you think the correct means of remediation are when things go wrong. And if that's not reflected if that is reflected in your policy, how do you make sure that people are adopting those behaviours? So what does a comprehensive training plan look like? How does that training exist outside of a 1 hour session that people never think about again after the fact? How do you communicate these this culture that you want to create on an ongoing basis? And in marketing, you have kind of a 7C communication structure, and I'm going to struggle to tell you all of them here.
You don't need to, don't worry.
But it's about essentially your clarity, how concise you are, how comprehensive the message is that you're communicating. And then there's one at the end that I always like to replace with consistency.
Yeah.
So it's that drip theory. It's how do you say this once and then make sure that it's said time and time again. So that's not just for the next 6 months while the spotlight's still on you. How do you know that somebody that started in your organization on day one of you changing was correctly onboarded, they've seen the policies, they've had the necessary training, and 3 years on, they've sat in meetings where things have been reiterated to them.
Yeah.
They've had to refresh their memory on our ways of working guide, because that really brings to life the way in which we interact with people and we communicate and we speak up if we don't have the ability to. We speak up if we experience behaviours that we don't think aligns to the values of the organisation, which leads on to having that comprehensive platform and process for people being able to speak up. And I'm sure in every podcast episode we come back to the fact that
not something you should think actually, but yeah, I've got an idea about that.
Obviously we deal with creating cultures where people feel like they can speak up, and that is in the moment. So being able to have that confidence of saying, actually that doesn't sit quite right with me. I don't like that behavior. I don't like what you've just said. Can we avoid having those kinds of conversations in the workplace? And then, as you've mentioned, that allyship, that active bystander action of speaking up to the person or with the person that was impacted after the fact. Whether that is with a platform that people can report on anonymously or named, or creating the channels where you can have those conversations with your line managers, and line managers are equipped in having those conversations on an ongoing basis to say, somebody's experienced something in my team and I know how to handle that. I know that I might not have the answer, I might not have the policy stored in my head of what I should be doing with this person here, but I know exactly where to go to, and I know the chains of command if I need support in being able to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I heard in one of your, in the previous podcast episode with Chelsea, of the horror stories, you referenced the horror stories where people don't actually speak to their line manager for months and months or ever. And if those relationships don't exist within your organization, then who do you have that's reinforcing policies to people? Who do you have for people to turn to ask questions if they're not quite sure where to go to? So
to lead by example, set a cultural tone.
Right, exactly, right. So when it comes to how do we make sure that after these reviews, how do we make sure that after these moments, we have that continuity of action? You need to have your team set up. You need to make sure that you have structures in place and you have the channels of communication to ensure that you can continuously communicate your policies in ways that are relatable, in ways that are easily understood, and in a way that people are going to see it as more than just a document and as what it means to be a part of your team.
Thanks so much, Kenya. It's been a really useful conversation. I think, it's been really helpful to reflect on whether or not people ever read policies, why they're useful, what is the purpose of them in an organisation, how they can be done badly, how they can be done well. We've talked a lot as well at the end there around cultural audits and these cultural reviews and whether they're effective and what people can do to make them effective. So thank you so much for this useful and really insightful episode, and looking forward to getting it out to people.
Well, no, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun. It's been, like I say, we talk about this stuff all the time, so it's good to do it on camera with a microphone for once.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Culture Shift. We hope you found it insightful and informative. We really appreciate your support and value your feedback. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share your thoughts, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated on when we release new episodes. If you're interested in our other content or how Culture Shift can help your organisation, check out our YouTube channel, website, or drop us a message, and I'll see you next time.